Hey, I'm Jusko from ProudMoney.com, and in this video we are going to look at the best unsecured credit cards for people with bad credit histories. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel if you have not already. And if you have already, I thank you for doing so. So we're going to look at the best unsecured credit cards for people with bad credit histories. Now, if you have a bad credit history, you might already know that it's not so easy to get an unsecured card, meaning a regular credit card that doesn't require you to put a security deposit down. When you have bad credit, many mainstream credit cards are going to reject you, and so the pool of potential cards that you might get is much smaller. Now, before we go further, I would tell you that if your credit is especially bad, I don't necessarily suggest that you get an unsecured credit card, because you might be better off instead going with a secured credit card that you do have to put a security deposit down for, but in many cases it's actually a better way to go, better way to build credit, better way for you to get in with a major bank that may give you the unsecured credit that you want down the road. But I understand that you came to this video for unsecured credit cards, so we're going to go talk about the secured credit cards again in a little bit. So I'm going to come back to those, but we're going to talk about unsecured credit first. Okay, so the first thing I would tell you is that you are going to need to know what your credit score is now to sort of get a feel for what you might be eligible for on the credit card market. Now, if you have bad credit, there's a possibility that you've already gone down this road and you know your credit scores. But if you are someone that has had some recent problems and you haven't really tried to get back into credit and you're just doing this for the first time, that's really the place to start. Figure out where you are. Just how bad is my credit? Is it kind of bad or is it really bad? So the place that I would suggest you do that is to go to the Discover site. Discover offers what I believe they still call the Discover Scorecard, and essentially you give them some of your information and they will give you a free FICO credit score. Now, FICO is the company that is sort of the most well-known in the credit scoring game, and so that is why I suggest that you use that Discover tool first, because it at least gives you a score that is probably close to what a lot of lenders would use who would actually give you a credit card. So that would be my suggestion. Start there, go to that Discover scorecard site, get an idea of what your FICO credit score is. Now, if your score is above 700, you probably don't need to be watching this video, because that's really not that bad, and there are enough credit cards out there in the market where you should be able to find one to accept you. So even if you've been rejected, that doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't get a different credit card somewhere else. We got a ton of videos about a ton of credit cards. So if you're over 700, you're not in that bad a shape. Now, I'm guessing you're under 700, you may be under 650, you may even be under 600. Now, where bad credit starts depends on the lender who's giving out credit cards or loans. What they consider to be bad credit may be different than what I consider or what you consider to be bad credit, but generally, if you are under 650, you're definitely getting in the range. If you're under 600, I would say that you are in the bad credit zone. So, depending on where you're at in that range, if you're sort of, up in that 650 plus, or even maybe over 600, probably what I would suggest, the first thing that you should do is go to Capital One and use their pre-qualification tool to see what Capital One might offer you. And the reason I say this is because Capital One, of the major credit card lenders, is probably the most friendly toward people that have had past credit problems. And if you use their pre-qualification tool and they tell you that you qualify for any of their cards that are unsecured, well, then that tells you that you're in a place, obviously, where they would potentially approve you, but maybe some other companies would as well. Now, none of that is a guarantee, but it is a good place to start to see how they see you, a major credit card issuer who tends to be friendly to bad credit customers. Now, if you use that Capital One pre-qualification tool and you are told that you don't qualify for any of Capital One's credit cards, or maybe you only qualify for their secured credit card, you may still want to apply for the Capital One Platinum MasterCard. Now, this seems like a little shaky advice, and it is a little gray area, I have to admit. However, I have known people to get to the pre-qualification tool and be told that the secured card is the only one that they qualify for, and then they go ahead and apply for the Capital One Platinum MasterCard, and they end up getting approved for it. So if your credit score is over 600, you might want to consider. If it's over 650, there's probably a much better shot that you are going to get approved for that card. But that is the card that I think of as the most entry level of any credit card from a major credit card issuer. So if you're going to get approved for an unsecured credit card from any of the bigger issuers, that would be the one if you have bad credit. So if you're in sort of that gray area and that shaky area and you want to give it a shot, that is the card that I would say to go after. Now, obviously, if you get rejected for that card, you may be worried about it because it could cost you some points on your credit score. And yes, that is a worry, but obviously anywhere you apply, there's the chance that you are going to get rejected. So for me, I feel like that is a chance that it could be, worth taking if you are up over 600. If you get rejected, then you at least kind of know better where you stand with the overall credit card market. All right, now let's say you got rejected from Capital One. Where do you go from here? Well, there are a couple of different options. The first one that I would talk about is a couple of smaller banks that work with bad credit customers that I tend to think of as being a little higher caliber than sort of the mass of small banks out there that might work with you. And those are Merrick Bank and the Allo MasterCards. Now, Merrick Bank has a lot of different cards that they could offer you, but probably their most well-known card or their most well-known offering is what they call the Double Your Line card. And what that means is if you are approved for the card and you make your payments on time for the first 7 months or 7 billing cycles, then Merrick Bank is essentially promising you that they are going to double your credit line. And if you're somebody that has bad credit, you may already know that you usually get fairly small credit lines to begin with, so knowing that you could double that credit line, in as little as 7 months is a very enticing thing. And Merrick Bank, in general, from what I know of them, also tends to have lower annual fees if they are going to charge you one, and maybe a little lower interest rates than some of the other credit card companies out there. And then there's Allo, which is a relatively new company in the credit card market, but so far seems to have mostly positive reviews from the people that have used them. So their sort of base card is a card that has no rewards, really nothing going on, but no annual fee for the most part, it seems, and interest rates that aren't great, but are maybe okay for someone that has a bad credit history. So it's not the greatest card necessarily, but the feedback about the company seems to be okay, and the fees and interest don't seem so out of whack with the market in terms of what you might expect when you have a lower credit score. So they're another company that we think is worth looking at. Now, 2 points to make about these credit cards. Neither Merrick Bank nor Allo allow you to just go to their website and fill out an application for their cards. You have to be invited to their cards. Now, you may be invited by regular mail if you are targeted for one of those cards that the company knows about you somehow, but many people also find them online through sites that essentially aggregate credit cards, sort of what you might think of as affiliate sites. Now, we have links in our own description and in the comments below, and I know that sometimes those cards show up in there if you fit the profile. I have seen people say that they have also found these cards through Credit Karma and through Experian, and if there are other places that you might go to sort of track your credit score, you potentially could find an invite there as well. Now, while I have put these two banks a little bit on a pedestal here above some of their other smaller bank competitors who serve the bad credit market, you should know that if your credit history is truly lousy, they're not necessarily going to treat you any better than any of those other companies would. You're still going to end up with very small credit lines, high fees, high interest. So I'm definitely not, saying you should expect a miracle here if you have really terrible credit history, but if your credit history is maybe a little bit, a cut above, it's not that terrible. These are, a couple companies that might offer you a little bit more in terms of maybe higher credit lines, maybe fewer fees, maybe interest rate that's not quite that bad. But again, you don't want to expect miracles if you have really, really bad credit. Now, if you've still found no joy after looking through all those options, probably the next place I would tell you to consider are retail credit cards or store credit cards. Store credit cards are known to be more friendly to people whose credit scores are not quite as good. They want you to come in and shop, and they are willing to, maybe look past some of your past credit issues. Now, the problem to some extent with a store credit card is the fact that oftentimes it can only be used at a certain store, so you don't necessarily have as wide of usage. Now, if your credit score is a little bit higher, sometimes you can qualify for the Visa or MasterCard version of some of these cards. The Walmart credit card is one you might want to consider. Obviously, Walmart sells many things, so that gives you, it's not quite as restricted as you might be with a smaller store. The Gap credit cards, gas station credit cards, obviously those ones are a little more restrictive because there's not as much of a selection of what you can buy. But anyway, if you can qualify for one of those, even if it's not ideal, it is potentially a way to get yourself into the credit card game, get yourself to be able to build some credit again, especially if you haven't had luck elsewhere. Now, if you've come this far and you still are not getting approved for anything, this is when you sort of go into what I consider to be sort of a lower tier of banks in terms of what you can expect. Now, these are cards like Credit One, the Indigo MasterCard, Milestone, First Savings, Blaze. There's Continental Finance that has a bunch of cards like Fit and Reflex and Surge. All of these cards are not ones that I really recommend, but they are cards that offer unsecured credit. So if you insist on getting unsecured credit and you still haven't been able to, these are places that you might still consider. Now, the problem with them, as far as I'm concerned, is small credit lines, high fees, high interest rates, and the worse your credit is, obviously, the worse those terms are going to be. And the bad thing about that is when you get a very small credit line and you're paying high fees to do so, you can only use it so often before you're butting up against the top of your credit line. So it's very difficult to build credit that way, so it takes a very long time, and you're going to pay a lot of money in the process, to get there, to rebuild that credit and get yourself to a higher level. Now, people do it and they use these cards, and some people, manage to get there, but many people end up unhappy with these cards once they actually have them in their possession because of the fees and the interest and everything else that I have just said. So I don't recommend them, but that's probably, kind of the, the last tier if you insist on going for an unsecured credit card. Which brings us back to secured credit cards, which I said I was going to get back to, and here we are. If you have very bad credit, getting an unsecured credit card is not necessarily in your best interests, especially if you have to get one of the cards that has small credit lines and has high fees. Now, a lot of people don't want to have to get a secured credit card because it requires you to put a refundable security deposit down just to get the card. But the upside to it is you can get secured credit cards from the major banks, or at least most of the major banks. And if you play your cards right, that could be something that you could sort of parlay into a regular unsecured credit card with better terms than you would get from many of these other ones. So basically, if you don't understand how a secured credit card works, you put down a security deposit. It's like putting down a security deposit for an apartment. You put down the deposit, you get the credit card, you use it just like any other credit card, and you pay it every month. And if you pay it off every month and you are making your payments on time, it will help you build credit. And after a certain period of time, many of these companies will tell you that they will look at your credit history, look at your payment history with that card, and they may either return that deposit to you and let you continue to use the card, or they may approve you for one of their other credit cards, what sometimes is called graduating from the secured card to the unsecured card. So for me, that's the better route for a lot of people. Now, I think Discover has a good secured card. Bank of America has a pretty decent secured card, but there are others as well. Getting in with one of those banks, I think, should be probably the goal if you have very bad credit, instead of dealing with these unsecured companies that aren't necessarily going to be a stepping stone to something better in the future. So that is it. Please, please, please put comments in the comments section below if you have had any experience with any of these cards, if you know of other cards that fit the profile of what we're talking about, if you have any data points in terms of what your credit score was when you got approved or rejected for any of those cards. That would obviously be hugely helpful to anybody else that watches this video and looks through the comments, so I would be very grateful for that. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, and as always, please go to proudmoney.com where we do credit card reviews. We have personal finance news, we talk deals, and all sorts of other fun stuff too. Thanks for watching. Bye.